Hey there. When a hospital gets hit by a ransomware attack, what happens next? Like, what does the hospital staff actually do? We are bringing you something different this week. It's an episode from another podcast I really like. It's called Click Here, and they cover the edges of the internet. Hackers, disinformation campaigns, weird corners of AI, and cybercrime. And in this episode, they take us inside a rural hospital in the hours and days and weeks after the hospital learns it's been hacked by a notorious Russian cyber gang. And we get a look at how a hospital actually works, like the guts of the machine. I mean, machines. It's an area we don't usually focus on, and it's fascinating and revealing. I think you're going to like it. We're going to be back with a new episode of An Arm and a Leg in a few weeks. Meanwhile, enjoy this episode of Click Here and take care of yourself.
From Recorded Future News, I'm Dina Temple-Rustin, and this is Click Here. It began with one of those dead-of-night phone calls, the ones that always seem to be attached to bad news.
My wife is a light sleeper, very light. So she, of course, is awakened by the phone call, and she listens to the conversation.
This is John Gady, and back in October 2020, he was the IT director for Sky Lakes Medical Center. It's a small 176-bed facility in Klamath Falls, Oregon, just off US 97 in the south-central part of the state. And John's wife was already piecing together what had gone wrong from his side of the conversation. There was a problem with the hospital's IT systems, the electronic patient records, pharmacy access, the program that allowed doctors to read MRIs remotely. All of them were down. And then the headline, Sky Lakes Medical was on the receiving end of a ransomware attack. Now, John Gady isn't a very excitable guy.
Very much not. Let's assess the situation. Let's improvise, adapt, and overcome, right? I think my response was, oh, wow.
So as he was pulling on his clothes, he was creating a kind of checklist in his mind. He's a clinician by training.
I approach healthcare IT from a clinician's perspective. So for me, all of IT is about patients. It's about patient care. That's why we're here. So my mind goes into a mode of what do we need to do to bring systems back online so the nurses and doctors and respiratory therapists so they can take care of patients.
And getting the systems back up and running was all the more critical because Sky Lakes Medical sits on the edge of the Cascade Mountain Range at 4,000 feet above sea level, and it's pretty isolated.
In order to leave that area, you have to ascend mountain range. And so traveling for a lot of people in the community can be very challenging, especially during the winter.
The next closest facility was 70 miles and a mountain pass away, which is why, just more generally, when something goes south at a rural hospital like this, it isn't just inconvenient, it's debilitating, even potentially life-threatening.
In rural hospitals, you can't just go across the block or 2 miles across town to get to another hospital. You don't have a diversion option, right? You can't divert your emergency department.
And John understood this in a visceral way. He grew up in a farming community in Southern California near the Mexican border, and he'd seen the importance of these kinds of facilities firsthand. The people they take care of aren't strangers.
It's your neighbor that you're likely going to be caring for or somebody you're going to see in the grocery store.
Which helps explain why just minutes after that pre-dawn call, John was in his car on the way to the hospital. There wasn't much of a mystery about what happened. They'd already found a ransomware note on a server.
And it said, and it was from the bad actors, and it said, you've been hit with Ryuk ransomware. Email us at this address. That's all it said.
Ryuk, one of the world's most notorious Russian ransomware gangs, had hacked into a system of this tiny rural hospital. And now, even the ever-chill John Gady was a little dumbstruck.
What I liken it to is getting struck by lightning. None of us get out of bed in the morning thinking we're going to get hit by lightning, right? But we know it does occur. There's some risk there, but we don't really equate that risk with reality.
And their new reality was that Ryuk had taken control of Skylake's entire network. And John's boss, he asked the question that was on just about everyone's mind.
John, how long do you think we're going to be down? And I said, well, University of Nebraska, they got hit just prior to, and they were down for 5 days. So I said, they were down for 5 days, so maybe 5 days? In total ignorance, right?
In the end, it turned out to be much longer than that. Sky Lakes Medical Center would be down for 23 days. I'm Dina Temple-Rust, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. And today, the anatomy of a ransomware attack on a very specific target, a rural hospital. Just in the past year, ransomware attacks on the U.S. healthcare industry have been up 130%. This is a story of how one little part of that industry, a rural hospital in Oregon, struggled to recover from such an attack and ended up providing a playbook for others who'd been struck by lightning too. Stay with us. From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. The first sign that something was wrong came from a nurse. She contacted the hospital's IT department saying something was wrong with her computer. Electronic patient records were taking forever to upload, she'd said, and she didn't seem to be able to access her email either. The on-call engineer logged onto the network to take a look.
He saw the CPUs on the computers pegged. They're all maxed out.
The CPUs, the processors on the network, which was a little weird, but maybe part of something else they were working on. So he moved over to the email server, and that's when he saw the README note from the hackers. And that's what led to John's early morning call.
We start to look at our servers, and we start to realize at that point that everything's encrypted with .ryk. All your folders are encrypted. Everything's locked up.
Ransomware attacks on hospitals were kind of a big thing in the fall of 2020. COVID was raging, hospitals were stressed, and hackers seemed to have made the perverse calculation that getting hospitals to pay ransoms during a pandemic would be easier. Hospitals were trying to save lives, they'd pay the ransoms just to make the hackers go away. And sure enough, when the ransomware attack happened, Sky Lakes was underwater with COVID patients.
We're using extra wings of the hospital that hadn't been used for patient care in years.
So, just like the hackers figured, their ransomware attack came at a time when John and his hospital would be extra desperate to resolve it. And Sky Lakes did have a pretty good cyber plan in place. They had backups, servers off-site. So John told the IT team to try firing up the network with backups. They started with the communication software, so at least everyone would have email again. A couple of clicks, some keyboard strokes, they hit enter. And the communication system started to boot up. And John thought, cool, problem solved, yay for backups. But then,
within 5 minutes, it was being encrypted again.
Wow. Backups alone weren't going to solve this. The ransomware was written to seize any file it found and start locking it up. So John made a tough decision.
I said, we're going offline right now. We made an executive, right-in-the-moment decision. We're shutting everything offline.
Now, it turns out, when it came to communications, the hospital caught a little bit of a break. While Sky Lake's internal communication systems were down, they had just recently added something to their suite of apps. The same thing lots of people were discovering during COVID, things like WebEx and Microsoft Teams. And while it wasn't the perfect solution, at least it was something.
We had about 1,500 employees at the hospital, and we had 50 employees, 50, that had access to WebEx.
So they used that program, which was outside their network, to tell the staff that Sky Lakes had been attacked by a ransomware gang.
And so we had people huddling around cell phones of people who had WebEx, Cisco WebEx loaded on it. We couldn't add any new users to it because we had no email. You had to have email to add new users, right?
Right.
So we were, but that having 50 licenses, users that had access on their cell phones allowed us to have people huddle around those 50 cell phones.
Which came with its own entirely separate tech problem, finding a cell phone signal.
And by the way, you're in hospitals, or you go to the bowels of the hospital, there's no cell service.
So everyone with one of those specific licenses was running around the hospital trying to get a cell signal.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
And that's how Skylakes told the staff what had happened that first day.
So at that 8:15 huddle, we announced that we've been hit with ransomware, and we at that point said we are going to be transparent. We are going to tell every doctor, nurse, clinician in patient access, environmental services, we're going to tell our patients when they come in.
And what they were also telling them was not just that a ransomware gang had locked up the network, but that in order to mitigate the damage, Skylakes' network was going to have to go dark. And they needed the staff to help them do that.
Any computers in their areas, they were to turn them off. So every system went off. Every computer went off. So that then spread by word of mouth.
And just to give you an idea of scale, the hospital had to pull the plug on 2,500 computers. The IT team had to take down some 600 servers. So everything that makes a modern hospital run, finance systems, patient health records, communications tools, electronic access to the pharmacy, all of it was going offline.
The only thing that was running in the hospital were directly attached devices to patients.
Ventilators, cardiac monitoring equipment, IVs, they were all fine because they weren't connected to the internet. But John said in today's modern hospitals, even the simplest thing has some sort of connected component to it. Even something simple like prescribing medication.
When you're going to dispense a medication, you scan the patient armband, and it's checking, is this the right medication? Is it the right dose? Is it the right time? How does it interact with other medications?
When you take that all away, well, you have to completely rethink how you're doing things. You have to go back to the way you did things before computers, when, say, people had to write things down. And that meant they needed pads and paper. We forget how many of the simplest things we do online now. This return to the pencil meant that by the time their networks were working again,
we bought out pretty much all the paper in our community at Staples and Walmart.
lab orders that previously had been a couple of clicks on a keyboard became a whole process, physically running them over to the lab, checking back to see if the results were in yet, checking again when they weren't. And these kinds of backup procedures worked fine for a day or two.
But when you hit 72 hours and beyond, you find out that all of those procedures and processes you had for the paper world start to break apart.
Just imagine the simplest thing, like drawing blood. These days, in a hospital, the blood is drawn and the test tubes are placed in this kind of pneumatic tube, which, with this giant sucking sound, sends the blood sample directly to the lab. On a typical day, this might happen hundreds of times. But to do that, you guessed it, you need to be connected to a computer. And if it's down, you're left with a really basic but significant problem.
Who's going to run those laboratory specimens back up to the laboratory, right? So we tried faxing, but what you discover when all of a sudden you have all your intensive care unit, your ICU orders, all of your OR, the operating room orders.
And things pile up.
That technology is slow, so all of a sudden a stat lab order could take 30 minutes to fax up to the laboratory, right? And so those processes break down.
Their machines were sending out so many faxes, they literally started to smoke. So John turned to something more antiquated, a human.
To help move the paper between the various operations and clinical areas of the hospital.
So people instead of electrons.
Yes.
John was triaging with doctors. Skylakes managed to keep the emergency room open, and John and the team started figuring out how to bring back critical care, things like chemotherapy. Because if cancer patients couldn't get their treatments at Sky Lakes, they'd have to drive all the way over the mountain pass to the nearest hospital.
So you might have to come in Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, or 3 or 4 days at a time for radiation treatment. That means I have to make that trip daily to drive 72 miles going through a treacherous pass.
And winter was coming.
Our patients are now having to leave the area. It's starting to snow.
When we come back, we go inside this hack and explain how Russian hackers got into Sky Lake's network in the first place. And then zoom out to look at why rural hospitals have become such a target. Stay with us.
Hey, Dan here. Hope you're enjoying this episode of Click Here, presented by us, An Arm and a Leg, which is a co-production of Public Road Productions and KFF Health News. All right, back to the story.
This is Click Here. Almost every week, we hear about another hospital system hackers have cracked into.
Inside Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, computer screens have been dark since hackers took over the data network.
A hack on a critical healthcare system causing havoc nationwide and in Nevada.
It doesn't give us any hope that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We have no idea when the systems will go back live.
And it isn't because hospitals are any less careful than other organizations. It's because hospitals, by virtue of all the systems they need to take care of patients, have an incredibly large and vulnerable attack surface.
So if you take a regular company that may have computers for the employees, and there are servers that provide applications for those employees, and maybe there's printers, maybe there are even security cameras.
This is Ophir Levy, the CTO of Medigate, a healthcare cybersecurity platform. If you look inside a hospital, there are a whole host of medical devices that are all connected to the internet in some way. And they're not just vulnerable because of the complexity and scale. There's also no standardization in the way a lot of medical systems patch and update their technology. Ophir says lots of these complex systems actually can't be easily updated, and even worse, are super old.
You change your laptop every 2 or 3 years, and a server every 3 or 4 or 5 years. An MRI machine can remain a state-of-the-art MRI machine for 15 or 20 years. So you have these legacy devices directly connected to the internet with no antivirus on them.
Which is wild when you think about the sensitive and sometimes life-saving data stored on these systems. What's more, because these are medical devices, there's some reticence to fool with them in any way. Even something like a firewall will be a little hands-off around medical devices.
Firewall vendors or the firewalls themselves are not built to understand what is normal and what is abnormal in the communication of medical devices. So what you usually find is that they allow just anything because no one wants to interrupt the normal operation of medical devices.
At Sky Lakes, the problem was twofold. Someone clicked on something they shouldn't have, which let the hackers into the email network, and then the hackers monkey-barred over to those medical device systems that didn't have great cyber protection, and then they just began locking things up. John Gady says cyber investigators from Cisco said it started with one employee.
They were able to tell us that on Monday at noon, an employee sat down at her computer. She got an email offering a bonus. She clicked on the link.
And just like that, the bad actors had the toehold they needed to download their hacking tools onto the hospital network. Then they started to look for ways to spread out, and they found PACS, or the Picture Archive Communication System. And all you need to know about it is that it makes those CT, MRI, and X-ray images digital, so doctors can read them remotely. Once the hackers got into this program, they started hopping into a bunch of other Sky Lakes systems too.
We were running on an older Microsoft operating system, and that's where they got their advanced access to move laterally to propagate through our network and get to the rest of our Windows devices.
It was that easy. A simple phishing email, an outdated operating system, and a hospital trying to juggle all the things that came with a global pandemic. Which brings us to the other niggling issue that John had to deal with. Sure, they figured out how to pinch hit, but that couldn't last forever. They had to figure out how to get their systems back from the hackers. They had to figure out how to deal with that ransom demand. And of all the things John was trying to juggle, that turned out to be one of the easiest, because all it required was, well, doing nothing at all. Skylakes wasn't going to pay the hackers a dime.
Within 48 hours, we knew there was no exfiltration, and that was about the time that I let the CEO and then thus the board know we're going to recover and rebuild our network. We can't tell you how many days that's going to take, but we're going to recover in that way.
In other words, no patient data was stolen. Typically, companies decide whether or not to pay a ransom based on what kinds of personal information the hackers have made off with. Since in this case they hadn't taken anything, Skylakes could forget the ransom and just focus on rebuilding their systems from backups. And the program they quickly decided to start the rebuild with was the one that would take care of that treacherous mountain pass problem. They started with radiation and oncology, though the issue with bringing these systems back online wasn't just technical.
From an IT perspective, I could bring a system like that back on in a half an hour. Then you have your regulatory issues. So we had to do rigorous validation to show that that system was not going to compromise patient care.
But deciding what to bring back up wasn't always obvious. There were unexpected things, like when the Skylakes facilities director flagged a problem that hadn't crossed anyone's mind.
Rick came to me and go, John, I can't heat the sidewalks. It's starting to snow outside, and we can't get patients into our emergency department.
If patients were struggling to get access to the hospital, then that was a top priority.
We didn't have a map for this. All of this was created in real time for us. And we're prioritizing our systems and which systems are going to come online.
And that PAC system for imaging, the site of the original hack, turns out the vendor helped them out.
There were a couple million images in there over multiple years. And we were able to recover all but of about 146 images.
In 2023, American entities paid more than $1 billion in ransomware payments, which is something the White House's Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, Ann Neuberger, has been focusing on for a while now.
Think about what we could accomplish if that money was spent on cybersecurity.
We spoke with her earlier this year in a restaurant in Munich.
Knowing that ransomware is really driven by financial gain, we need to turn off the spigot, make it riskier, costlier, and harder to conduct those operations. We are reinforcing the norm that hospitals should really be off bounds for any attackers, particularly criminal attackers.
Which isn't as wildly optimistic as it first sounds. Hackers themselves have talked on underground forums about how hospitals should be a no-go zone. And some have actually put their money where their mouth is. In 2022, Lockbit, another notorious Russian-language ransomware group, gave a Toronto children's hospital a decryptor and then actually apologized after one of its affiliates had attacked it. But again, we're talking about criminals here, so you can't assume they'll coalesce around doing the right thing. In fact, just this summer alone, there have been a spate of attacks.
Ascension Hospital still in the throes of a massive cyber
Following
attack.
a cyber attack on some of London's major hospitals. The incident is said to be having a major impact on the delivery of services, with blood transfusions particularly
from
affected.
The phone lines and websites to crash to non-emergency surgeries now being rescheduled.
The healthcare industry isn't waiting around for the kindness of cybercriminals. This summer, the White House unveiled a new initiative aimed at bringing down the high cost of cybersecurity for hospitals. It announced that it would not only offer free cybersecurity services to the country's nearly 2,000 rural institutions, but also work with Google and Microsoft to treat the nation's hospitals the same way they treat universities, and give them software and services at a discounted rate. John Rigi, a cybersecurity advisor for the American Hospital Association, was involved with the deal.
It was our suggestion to the White House to bring in Google and Microsoft and to ask them if they would provide us with the same nonprofit pricing that they provide to academia and state and local government. And when I mentioned that to Ann
Newberger, who you just heard from,
and they approached Google and Microsoft, and they were all in. So all we had to do was ask and, just kind of think out of the box.
It kind of seems like common sense here.
Right. I like to do that, Dina. Just take a common sense idea and not overcomplicate it. And let's say, why don't we just ask?
As for Skylakes, after 23 days of rebuilding their network, they were fully back online. And over the years since then, they've invested in new tech and now have downtime procedures for every single piece of equipment and process at the hospital.
This will be never ending, and it's a vigilant task. I wish the industry that when every one of these would happen, that you could get on the line, we could have this kind of conversation with every hospital so we could sharpen each other.
John's working at a different rural hospital now, one in New Mexico. But everywhere he goes, he's sounding the alarm.
I'm an evangelist now around this topic. Whoever will listen, we need to talk about this.
This is Click Here.
Today's episode was produced by Megan Dietrich, Sean Powers, Kat Scheknecht, and me, Jade Abdul-Malik. It was edited by Karen Duffin, fact-checked by Darren Ankrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Martin Peralta is our sound designer and engineer. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News. Tune in on Friday for Mic Drop, which features our favorite interview of the week. We'll have a new episode of Click Here on Tuesday. We'll see you then.